G'day, mate. Or rather, degenerates, degeneratas, and degenerati. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 293, featuring Israel Adesanya and, as I referred to him last week, the hero of the MMA community, Sean Strickland, going at it down under for the middleweight title. Not particularly fond of that main event from a moneyline perspective, nor this card, if I'm being honest, after last week's juicy results. Not even speaking to myself, really. I don't believe any underdogs won at UFC Paris. It was still a winning event for MMA Rax, the 9th of the last 11, and we will go for 10 of 12 this weekend. The last pay-per-view was a very fruitful one. And don't look now, but since declaring myself the best in the world on International Fight Week, I've only won on all three of the international UFC events since that declaration the first week of July. It's now 2 months since then, and we're going for a fourth profitable international event in a row. It's not going to be easy because, as I said, it is looking like a bit of a juicy card. And last week, there weren't any underdog wins, so you figure someone's got to hit this week, right? And there's more than a few candidates, but the one underdog that I was on, the line has been bouncing around even before he was an underdog, and now he's apparently the favorite, but it's still kind of a pick'em, so it's all over the place. But I have my more confident plays, and we'll get to them. Thankfully, I didn't miss any favorites last week. I don't have any sins to atone for other than that Moises biff. But again, plus money's plus money, so we just look past it and move on. And that's exactly what we'll do. Gonna try to make it a quick show today because I do have a rather important article to spin up tonight elsewhere. And also, it's the start of the NFL season, and I do have some fantasy investments in that Kansas City Chiefs backfield. So, I'm going to have an eye on that, going to be want to be looking at that. I'm going to try to breeze through most of these, and I know I say that and then usually go for an hour and 30 minutes, but it's kind of a similar story with a lot of these picks. You'll notice a lot of local favoritism, but it's kind of a theme that you have to take into account with this sport relative to the judging and the crowd experience, particularly down under. Speaking of which, we'll get to that with the very first fight, which is Shane Jung and Gabriel Miranda. I did more tape for this fight than probably any of the other ones just because I haven't watched Shane Jung since I picked Blake Builder to beat him as an underdog this year. The first underdog I picked this year, actually, and that converted. I just didn't really see much from Shane Jung that was going to make me optimistic that he could beat a guy that was visibly more athletic than him and just coming in with more confidence. I would say the athleticism definitely favors Miranda here as well, but the problem is he's not exactly bringing the same well-rounded level of accomplishment that Builder was going into that fight. Miranda's a guy who kind of needs to get it done in the first 5 minutes or it ain't going to get done. I think there is some question about level of competition. He took the Saint Denis fight on short notice at lightweight, I believe. So he's coming down to featherweight here. So I think he's probably going to look much, much bigger at the weigh-ins than Jung will. But there's still much to consider for Jung here, both in terms of having the better gym with City Kickboxing, actually having experience going the distance, and even though his final round winning percentage isn't as great, he's at least won a fight by decision in his MMA career. Miranda hasn't done that. So if he's able to drag this to the scorecards and he's got the crowd on his side the whole time, even if he's not necessarily landing with pop, we've seen this effect with London and even going back to like 283 with Brazil, but also Singapore And last week in Paris, the local guys that have the crowd on their side, pretty much anytime they're landing, even when they're landing like head kicks that get checked and they don't actually do anything, the ooh and the ah of the fans has an effect on these judges. And that's going to be something very prevalent for Australia. He had a favorable crowd with him when he fought against Builder, and it's going to be a similar thing here. He's a city kickboxing guy, so it's not only that he has the more favorable gym, but he has the gym tied to the big names at the highest level at the UFC, including the main event on this card. There's a lot to like on paper, in theory, just with the variables that I look at relative to Shane Young. But then you go look at the tape and you see the momentary stint that Miranda had with Saint-Denis in the beginning of their fight. But you also have to consider that was over a year ago, and Shane Young fought at, I believe it was UFC 284. So he's competed 5 months more recently than Miranda has, in addition to what I just said earlier. And so you're banking on, okay, like, is Miranda going to get a first-round finish on Young? I believe Miranda's got one knockout in his MMA career, if I'm correct on that. He's got one of them, and he's been knocked out twice. So he has less KOs than knockouts. That didn't make sense. He has less wins by KO than losses. That's kind of rare for the UFC level, and that's definitely not good. I don't know if he's going to get a second career KO on Shane Young. You would have to think he'd be more likely to get a submission, but Young's never been submitted in MMA. So I think that it's very, very likely here that this is going to end up being a bit of a slop fest. I think it's possible that Miranda, pretty much outclasses Young in the first round, but Young is able to make some adjustments in the second round where there's a bit more pushback, and then going into the third round, Young is kind of more in control because Miranda just does not have a history of going well or competing well up to the same standard in the first round over a 15-minute stretch. So in a close fight, I feel like you got to favor the guy who's going to have the international sway of the crowd and the judging here in Shane Young. I recognize the risk here that Miranda presents, especially because the data that I have on him for building the base of this grade is based off of less than one round of UFC cage time. But there's too many other variables beyond the data here, as I alluded to with the gym and the ring rust and the local edge, that you can't feel good about taking Miranda as an underdog, and you have to feel good about Shane Young. So I have a bit of I get a bit of a pit in my stomach every time I make the opening pick for my series, one of my main parlay legs for the week. The last time I did it, I did get away with it, and it was, I've done that a few times of late and been successful. Obviously last week I had the Fareed Basharat, but that was a week where I only had 4 picks and we're trying to build 3-leg parlays. I did it with Andre Petroski, Martin Boudet, CJ Vergara, I believe, UFC 291, although I didn't win that night. Jesus Aguilar was the one I was thinking of in terms of when that worked. Alexander Romanov, I believe I might have made a main leg for that evening as well. So UFC Vegas 76, the last time Sean Strickland fought. But at UFC 289, I did it with Blake Builder, and it killed all the parlays immediately that night. And it was kind of devastating. And last year I had a big series early on before I went public with MMA Rax, where I had the opening fight kill so many of my parlays. It even did happen on MMA Racks, I believe, in one of the first weekends I went public when I took the over 2.5 rounds on Kyle Dawkins Roman Dolidze. Whoops. Those Dawkins chins. I learned my lesson as we figured out at UFC Vegas 78. So anyway, I'm going with Jung here. I don't know if I can make him a leg just because of that voodoo bad vibes I get from making the opening fight the leg and recognizing here that it's a bit of an incomplete data set with Miranda. I'm still going to take Jung. I'll make him a leg on the moonshot just because I have 8 picks this week. But I'm also thinking I might have to do a thing where I do 4 legs instead of 3, like what I did for UFC 292. That ended up paying off, but I still need to figure out which of the picks that I would make the last 2 legs would I feel most confident with among the pieces we have to play with. And I think I'm going to rule out Jung just because there's some other commodities I'd rather invest in, which we're going to get to next, including Jamie Mullarkey and John Makdessi. If you go back, I believe it was UFC Vegas 76. One of the proudest calls of that evening, aside from the clean sweep, was I told folks, do not bet Jamie Mullarkey against... There were 2 fellows, I believe, from Tajikistan that were fighting that night, and I'm forgetting the name of the man that defeated Mr. Mullarkey. It was Muhammadjan Naimov. But Mullarkey was pretty easily in control of that first round and then wasn't necessarily fading, but just didn't quite have it operating at the same level of dominance that he did in the first round going into the second. And Muhammadjan had a one-punch lights-out threat, and he hit Mullarkey with it, who had a bad chin, and he went down. Makdessi doesn't have those same tools, and he's also 9 years older, and he has absolutely no threat of takedowns. Even the times where he has shot in his UFC career, he hasn't gotten them. He's never landed a takedown, and this is going to be his 20th fight, which is somewhat baffling. As good as he's been, but the problem is all of his success has been built on kickboxing, and he's 38 years old now. He hasn't fought in a year since getting dominated by Nasrat Haqparast. Prior to that fight, he hadn't competed in 17 months. So his only competition in the last 29 months, okay, that's almost the 2.5 years, is him getting dominated by Haqparast at UFC Paris last year. Makdessi's been serviceable, and earlier in his career he was one of those guys that, in theory it's kind of the same thing as Adesanya in terms of, obviously he's way more undersized, but my takedown defense is so good that I'm going to force the fight on my terms the way I want and use my striking tools to win. He just never really quite had the same fist striking power threat. So the style doesn't quite rise to the championship level in that case, nor does he have the length. It's interesting seeing his frame for the style that he elects to use, because he is he's a solid athlete, but he's just the range isn't there for what you would necessarily want, and that's where I think Mullarkey is going to be able to protect himself. I think he should have an easy time controlling the range, and short of him eating like a kick or something, I don't see him getting caught by like an uppercut or something that puts him down, or a punch the way that he got dropped in the Muhammad Naimov fight. So I just don't think Makdessi has been around enough, nor has demonstrated enough well-roundedness throughout his career to show that he's going to be able to get at least 10 minutes away from Mullarkey in this fight, where he's in friendly confines. Especially if you watch the Haqparast fight from last year, for as lofty as Makdessi's takedown defense is, Haqparast took him down with almost no resistance, like 2 times very late in the fight after he had already dominated him. So I don't know how high Makdessi's takedown defense in his career was prior to that. I could probably look it up just because the grade I have for that is still out there. But I think that you're in a pretty good spot here to fade Makdessi, even if you're concerned about Mullarkey, as I was the last time Mullarkey fought, and I told people, stay off that, don't bet it. He was valued way too highly in that case. I think as far out to that 400 range at one point, which was kind of hilarious to see in hindsight. So I said when I was putting the grade out this week, I believe Mullarkey was at 270, and I said don't bet him if he gets out to the 300 range. And we're seeing now that he is at 260, so he's come down a bit. So I feel good about playing him at that price. The age gap here is, I think, far too significant to ignore. It's just such when you're getting out to like a decade at that point, it's not quite a decade in this case, but it's so consistently in the favor of the person that is on the younger side in that case. And we saw Makdessi's greatest strength for putting the fight on his terms get kind of thrown out, discarded very easily in his last appearance that wasn't even impressive for himself relative to striking. So he doesn't necessarily have the edge on attrition to the extent you would think with Mullarkey, even though Mullarkey's more recent results haven't been good. And Makdessi does train at a better gym out of Rafufu Sport up in Wisconsin, I believe. So he moved there in 2018, and I think it's why he was able to grind out a split decision win over Ignacio Bahamondes as recently as 2 years ago. But Mullarkey's going to have a 6-inch reach advantage. That's very significant anytime you're getting out to a half foot or longer. And I think that he's just going to be able to keep himself from getting hurt in a way that Makdessi's not going to be able to prevent for himself. Even though Makdessi has shown better striking defense in his career and is going to have the edge in volume. And not only that, he also has been to twice as many decisions as Mullarkey has. But again, Mullarkey's going to have the crowd. And in a fight where each guy doesn't necessarily pose a one-punch knockout threat, when Mullarkey lands, the crowd is going to be more enthusiastic than when Makdessi does. And I think that's going to wear on him as the fight goes. And I think they are trying to throw Mullarkey a bit of a bone here, even though he really, really biffed that last appearance. I think they're trying to salvage him a bit in terms of being a gatekeeper for maybe rising contenders that are more suitable for Makdessi's level. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't want to say contenders, but it would be difficult. You would think Mullarkey at this point is settling into being like a fringe rankings guy, if even a rankings eligible fighter at all.
But there's certainly guys that are either on their way out of the UFC or that have just arrived or perhaps don't really belong there that he can beat. And I think the biggest thing is just at this point, is he going to get matched up with guys that'll give him the striking battles that he wants, but pose a greater power threat than what he can deliver back? That isn't the case here. Short of him getting caught by a stray head kick, I think whether he ends up finding a finish on Makdessi or he's able to go the distance, perhaps dropping around along the way, but otherwise having the more enthusiastic performance, and certainly well-rounded by MMA standards, I would imagine. Given between the two of them, Mullarkey's takedown rate is so much more prevalent. I'm going to take Mullarkey here, but again, I have my reservations about him just because I've done stay away in the past. I would say, even though my grade technically isn't as high as my grade on Jung is, and Jung is at a certainly better price, I just know from the experience of watching this fighter since his his performance against Jalen Turner last year, that I've seen this fighter enough that I have a better read on them than the case of Jung against Miranda, where Miranda is such a new, more unknown commodity at the UFC level. So I feel good about playing Mullarkey here, but again, I'll probably end up hedging in terms of how I build my parlays using him this week. The next fight is Jack Jenkins and Chepe Mariscal. That Jenkins, his last performance, that was the start of this the run that totally flipped the script for this account this year. I mean, if you tailed every parlay up to that point when Jenkins fought Jamal Emmers back at UFC Jacksonville, then you were down probably like 80 units at that point or something going into that weekend. And then your boy picked 14 in a row. 16 in a row, actually, going into the UFC 290. And then the Jimmy Crute streak snapped it. But the streak started with Jack Jenkins getting a bit of a greasy split over Jamal Emmers. I did watch the fight again. I didn't think Jenkins won the first time I watched it. I could see the case for giving him a 29-28 based on the first two rounds after the second rewatch, but I still wouldn't have given it to him. And the two guys that did give it to Jenkins, you can't ignore it. It was Sal D'Amato and Chris Lee, and I remember everybody saying, that's one of the worst decisions of the year. Oh, it's bullshit. It's blah, 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 blah. And I'm over here laughing, and I have no idea what's even in store for the rest of the night, but I'm just so happy that my YOLO underdog Jack Jenkins comes through. What was really interesting was that Jamal Emmers had the favorite, he didn't just dominate the final round outright. He had the edge with the crowd as well in terms of the local Floridians supporting him over the internationally visiting Aussie guy. I think that Jenkins got shown a bit of favoritism there from the judges just because he is a former Dana White's Contender Series guy, and he's also a guy that, like they've shown they want to do with Mullarkey, they can just shove this guy on every card they have in Australia. And this is the second pay-per-view they've done there this year. The 284 was such a success, they said, yeah, we'll come back. We'll bring Izzy too this time. We got City Kickboxing ready to roll all the time. And we're going to get to Ulberg later. We already talked about Shane Young. Anyway, my point is, Jenkins now comes back and he gets Chepe Mariscal, and I don't think Mariscal was a late fill-in for the Trevor Peek fight, but I mean that was one of my favorite fights of the year, just in terms of being an all-out brawl, and the most I tweeted it out at the time, the most artistic moment of the year, other than Izzy's arrow shoot at 287, which I was like sitting 50 yards away from when it happened. Chepe looking at Trevor Peek as Peek put his arm up on the fence like, God damn, I am exhausted. And Chepe was in the middle of the ring and miming a red cape and giving the Toro sign, the Olay, to Peek like, hey, get over here and finish your ass beating, Chief. It was so literally turned into a matador in a bowl in there in that octagon ring. It was so great. It was so funny. And I was so happy for the people that bet Chepe that night. I'm seeing a lot of underdog love, and I get it. Because I do think, based on how Emmers dominated that final round against Jenkins, if Mariscal is able to clinch this fight up, if he's able to get to the ground, he presumably is going to have a wrestling advantage, just based on what you saw against Peek. But you got to remember that, like, we didn't think Peek was really UFC level. And Jenkins is a guy that has shown a well-rounded MMA skill set and a disciplined approach, and I think that's why he's being shown so much love here. I wish this was lined closer, but I do understand, given where my grade is for Jenkins, I see why he's got the 2-1 odds here. So I've got concerns again about this fight too, just because I recognize Mariscal's good, and there's, even though it's 15 minutes of data, there's only one fight that we can really use to evaluate him effectively here. And he does, just going off of strictly strength of schedule, I mean, he's got a win over Pat Sabatini in the last 5 years. He's got a much more impressive record of fighters he's competed with than Jenkins does at this stage. So I don't fault anyone for liking Mariscal here, but I really do feel good about Jenkins, especially if this fight goes to decision. Again, he's going to have the crowd, and if it goes the distance, I think he does have the better history. I'll, confirm that. He actually, Mariscal has twice as many fights going the distance in his career, but Jenkins does have over 30% more success. He wins the final round nearly a third more of the time than Mariscal does. So even though Mariscal does have more experience, it isn't necessarily successful experience when the fight gets dragged out. So I think Jenkins has enough tools and showed enough grit and strategy against a trickier opponent for him like Emmers that was way longer than you're used to seeing, particularly at featherweight. Mariscal is going to slightly have the reach advantage here, but not going to be nearly as tall. And I think that'll be something that's welcome for Jenkins after he really had to dig deep for his last performance and even got shown a bit of grace on the scorecards, as many would say. But I'm not complaining about that, and it's very possible he could get shown some grace on the scorecards again in this fight, given not only does he have the promo push edge here, but he's also got, because he's a Contender Series veteran, but he's also got the local favorite going for him. Crowd's going to be on his side if it goes the distance, and he's able to get the third round, and he's won at least one of the first two. then he's got it 29-28. So I'm going to take Jenkins by decision. I do think it's going to be a war, potential fight of the night candidate. But Jenkins is going to build his profile again, and it wouldn't surprise me if they keep him on the shelf for another Australian pay-per-view potentially early next year. So we'll see how that goes. It's too bad Mariscal, they didn't save him for UFC Noche next weekend. I think that would have been a more welcome venue, and I would have liked to see who they could have matched him up with, but I understand them wanting to give Mr. Jack Jenkins an entertaining brawl. So the next fight is Carlos Ulberg and Dawoon Jung. All right, there's not really much that needs to be said here. Ulberg, like I keep telling you, the whole theme of the show is local favorite and better gym. There's a lot of those cases here because it's not only city kickboxing guys, but it's guys that are fighting locally versus guys that are being imported from other continents. That's unique to Australia just because if you don't live in Australia, you got New Zealand, and then that's basically it. Unless you're, I don't know, Papua New Guinea. Papau. Oh, forgive me. We're slowly becoming an international product, folks. We'll get it figured out. But my point is, Dawoon Jung is not set up for success here. He was set up for success at that botched Korean card that got repurposed into an Apex event, and then he was, I believe, the co-main against Devin Clark, and Devin Clark ended up scoring the upset on him. That was kind of a devastating night for yours truly because, I mean, it was a terrible parlay that was built up on Doo Ho Choi and Dawoon Jung. And, man, Choi, Kyle Nelson, who I believe is fighting next week and is my new archenemy, especially after that builder result I alluded to earlier in the show. But the maze of results in this sport is just so crazy when you end up chasing it around for so long. But it is so wild to look back on that. I believe it was in February relative to just how much has happened in the UFC since and where MMA Rax is now. Because that was a pretty embarrassing evening. And I remember thinking, what did I see in this guy Jung that made me think he was going to beat a guy like Clark, who I picked to beat Azamat Murzakanov? Like, it just shows you how your own eyes can deceive you if you fall too far into the tape sometimes. You just don't take what the data gives you. And I come to here, and Ulberg is a guy that has just been nothing but absolute money for me from since last year. One of the earliest success story, I don't want to say stories, but one of the earliest money makers for MMA Rax. I picked him to beat Tafan and Chukwi. I was kind of alarmed that he was the underdog in that fight and was very vocal about thinking that he shouldn't be. And I remember that pick, in tandem with me picking Cody Durden to beat JP Buys on that same card, even though I didn't make money on that card, those two underdog plays were big in terms of my early, pre-100 follower days, establishing that I at least knew what I was talking about from a capping perspective. So I was very, very fond of that moment in my early career of going live with this. So I bring that up just because I think about how I was also very eager to see Nikolai Negomarianu after foiling one of my earliest picks ever in taking Kennedy and Chekwu to beat him, and then also taking the over 2.5, I believe, when he fought Ihor Poteria. He was just one of those guys that I couldn't get a read on and really just kind of bothered me. And then he got matched up with Ulberg, and I thought, okay, he's going to get exposed here. Like, Ulberg is definitely going to thwomp this guy. And it happened, and I remember just being so, it was one of the only KOs that I stood up and cheered for last year. I try to maintain my composure when I watch this sport around other people, but in that case, I had the read on it, and I barely missed a 5-leg parlay with him that night. I believe it was UFC 281, but my God, I was so happy to see him knock that guy out. And I look at this fight, and I know that Jung got the better of Kennedy and Chepe, who's the one guy that got the better of Ulberg previously in the UFC. But it just feels like Jung has kind of lost it in terms of the striking success. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt that the split decision against Sam Alvey wasn't, he dominated it a bit more than was deserved. He landed one of the most devastating elbows I've ever heard towards the end of that fight. But he's just been kind of on a downward trend. And the Clark result was really, really disappointing, and that was, again, a result where he was kind of set up for success. This is not a setup for success result against Ulberg. This is a spot they're trying to really make Ulberg a star. If he isn't already in, like, the Eastern Hemisphere, like, they're trying to I think they're really trying to give this guy a push. I'm surprised that they haven't really given him more spots, given his ties to city kickboxing and the turbulence that the light heavyweight division has seen, the kind of need for that division to get stars. It was one of the reasons why I was surprised Jailton Almeida decided to make his push in the heavyweight division as opposed to light heavyweight. Because he did beat Anton Turkalj, who we're going to get to in the next fight. But anyway, you kind of see where I'm going with this. I'm super confident in Ulberg. Short of him getting, like, kind of caught in a trading exchange the way that Jung was able to catch in Chepe, we've seen Ulberg make corrections to his fight IQ issues with a great gym like City Kickboxing that we haven't necessarily seen from Kennedy and Chepe, and that we haven't seen the same kind of improvement that Ulberg has had relative to Jung, where we've seen kind of a decline, and reasons to be concerned about equally bad chins in each of these cases. But I would expect Ulberg, as the guy who clearly has the offensive striking advantages pronounced both in terms of volume and efficiency, you have to think that he's going to be able to land more often the way he wants, get more damage that puts him in a better position to find a finish. And on top of having the crowd on his side, the momentum is going to be entirely in his favor. So I really, really like Ulberg in this spot. I am making him a leg this week. He is my most confident pick on the entire card. It'll be interesting to see what the UFC does with Dawoon Jung after this. But I really, really do think that Ulberg is in a good spot to get a first-round knockout. So give me Carlos Ulberg to get it done early and get the crowd very excited with what wouldn't surprise me if it's the first finish of the night. Relative to the fights that I just gave out picks for. So we'll see how it goes and how excited the Outback gets. The next fight is Tyson Pedro and Anton the Pleasure Man Turkalj. The line has just been all over the place. So full disclaimer, because I know eventually, like, I see people complaining about this a lot on Twitter for other cappers, like, oh, you're posting a line from 2 months ago. Why didn't you post it then? And then you could have tipped us. When I put this pick out for Pedro, when I wrote the tweet and then scheduled it, he was plus 105, and I said, okay, that's what I'm dialing it in as. When I checked like 5 minutes before the tweet was going to go out, like later that night, he had flipped all the way out to like minus 116 or something. I'm like, you got to be fucking. And I'm like, okay, this is the only underdog I have this week. I am leaving it in as an underdog. I don't give a shit. And if somebody bid like, oh, when did you get that price? Everybody should know by this point that I don't even lock in my bets. I am results oriented over value. I don't even bet until I see them make weight on the scale. And that's something that a lot of people in this sport do. And it's a good thing to do as a last minute fail safe in case someone that you don't expect to have a bad weight cut does, and you don't, it can end up saving your parlay in some cases. I've gotten absolutely destroyed on weight cut hedging this year. It's been very well documented both from me personally and what's on Twitter, but it's still good to have that there as a fail safe. I'm confident that long term it's going to pay off for me and save me in a lot more cases than when it doesn't. So I look at this Tyson Pedro and Anton Turkalj, and I see why the line is flipped around so much left to right. And it would be great if one of them just has a bad weight cut to light heavyweight, and then I could just say, okay, I'm not gonna I'm done. I'm gonna cancel this pick. But Pedro was the only underdog I had this week, so I had to stay with him. Even if he's not gonna end up being an underdog, he'll still end up being one of the best value picks this week, just because so much of the picks are already juiced. The theme of the card is the local guy's going to win, right? And that's where we're at with Pedro again. It's kind of lazy. That's, a thing to keep pointing to, but it is something that is crucial. In the case of Pedro, it is a bit unique because I don't believe he's ever won a fight that has gone to decision. So he is a guy that is probably going to need to finish this in the first half to get it done. The only person that I believe has ever finished Turkalj is Almeida. And Turkalj showed surprisingly adept submission defense skills. He also caught Vitor Belfort. Not Vitor Belfort, but whoever he fought in his previous appearance. Vitor Belfort. Forgive me, folks. I ain't been doing this very long. He fought Vitor Petrino. Yeah, not Belfort. Vitor Petrino. And survived to a decision, even though he coughed up a 10-8, I believe, in the final round. He did catch Vitor Petrino with an up kick in the first that I believe had a big effect in dragging that fight out as long as it did. So he perhaps got a little bit lucky with that, but given that he showed in some cases better ground resistance skill, I would say that he showed better resistance to Almeida on the ground than Rosenstrike did. So I don't know how confident I am that Pedro is going to be able to slip in an early finish even if he gets advantageous position. The numbers say Pedro's going to have the striking advantage, but Pedro really doesn't have anything in his hands at this point. He's like all kicks. So he's going to need to be all kicks and then shooting the takedown and then finding a submission on a guy that has shown good durability against fighters that have offered more of a threat offensively than Pedro does here. So I see why it's a pick'em, but there's just so many, as I said, the crowd edge can't be ignored here if this does go the distance. And you wonder too why Pedro's even on the main card, especially over Carlos Ulberg. Pedro's career's been baffling, and there's a lot of guys rooting for him, particularly in Australia. But it's interesting that the UFC has given him this much rope, given the trio of ACL surgeries he had, including the knee surgeries he had, including the first one that was botched. There's probably some sympathy there, but for guys like this guy and the Tafas to be consistently shown this main card love is it's surprising. But it must just speak to the fandom that they have in those countries, because they have these deals that I believe the state governments are making with the UFC. I think they said it was something like $16 million for them to do 2 pay-per-views there this year. So they welcome that. And I guess having fighters like Pedro and Tafa on the main card are what you pay for, $16 million. I see more avenues to victory for Pedro than I do Turkalj, but there is so much risk with picking Pedro. I made Pedro a leg when he fought Bukauskas, and I was devastated watching. I might have been out of it at that point already, but just in terms of another leg already losing earlier that night. But Pedro just not really having anything beyond the first round and not even getting it outright from the judges against Bukauskas. It was tough to watch that performance. I was expecting more out of him given what we saw from him against Harry Hunsucker and Ike Villanueva last year, who were both kind of cans at that point. But we didn't really know at that point whether Bukauskas was a welcome back UFC commodity or not. And we have a better sense now, although I think he was shown a bit of grace in his decision win over Zach Pauga as well. But I hedged on rounds in that fight, so I'm happy either way. Give me Pedro here. Probably strap him onto the back end of a parlay for some extra value. But yeah, definitely not making him a leg here in this case. He's the more experienced guy. He has more avenues to a victory, even if he hasn't necessarily gotten a win by decision yet. And we still need to see Turkalj prove himself a bit, but this would be a good spot to do it. So Turkalj does win, I'd be curious to see where he goes from here. If he loses, there's going to be a case for him being cut, given he's lost 3 UFC appearances to start his career with the promotion. So the next fight is Justin Tafa and Austen Lane. All right, so I could do like the lazy thing that a lot of these other shows do and be like, I'm going to splice in my previous analysis from when this fight happened back in June, and you can just listen to that again. But I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to say that I was technically correct in saying that the fight was going to end in the first half. I know it was technically a no contest, but look, Lane, you saw in that fight, I had put out, I had been saying that you really got to be cautious of when the guy has a half-foot reach advantage and half-foot height advantage. There's just too many conflicting variables here that make me feel good about taking a side. The other thing that Lane had going for him going into that fight was he had much better defensive striking stats just from those limited Contender Series appearances, even though he didn't have great success on there. but he was also going to have the crowd on his side because he was super hyped for that fight because of the whole, started my NFL career with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and now I get to have this big moment here on a main card in Jacksonville for my MMA career. He was super hyped, and then he goes out and he commits the worst eye poke maybe the worst eye poke I've seen since I started doing this. I don't know if it's the worst I've ever seen watching this sport outright, but it's certainly one of them. I'm surprised that Tafa's back fighting again so soon and is wanting the rematch, but that probably speaks to how eager he is to get the finish. And the crowd pendulum has now swung in his favor and has put that fight in a position where I don't know where Tafa was favored on the money line in the last fight, but I just remember feeling much, much better about the under given the mutual success both of them needed to lean on for getting early stoppages and thinking that they were going to trade into an exchange. Fight only lasted 30 seconds, and I was a little bit concerned about Tafa finding the measuring in because Lane was having success. But Lane's chin, it's he's got the worse attrition here than Tafa does. And if Tafa's able to crash that range, and he's going to, you just have to imagine these guys are going to trade and one of them's going to go down. So I think Tafa's going to be going in more confident than he did last time. And he's going to be going in certainly more pissed off. And Lane isn't going to necessarily have that same prideful edge as much as he's just going to be trying to atone for his sin and correct his mistake. So it's interesting how the dynamic has kind of flipped here and now ballooned Tafa out to being this 2-1 favorite. But I think because the price on the under is basically the same as what Tafa is, if you're confident that Tafa is going to win by first round knockout if he does win, then you're better off taking the under because the other side of it is Lane catches Tafa early in one of those exchanges. So give me the under here, making it a leg this week. You saw how leaning on a Tafa first round knockout did at UFC Singapore. And I made the joke about lightning striking twice. That was relative to Parker Porter. Now we might have a lightning striking twice inside of a 3-weekend scenario here. So give me the under. I think you can play Tafa money line too if you want to. I'm just saying the better bet is the under 1.5 because you're also getting the risk in that case that Lane is able to catch Tafa in the exchange. So I'll be making this a leg with Carlos Ulberg and then kind of figuring it out from there. So we'll see what other legs I opt to include in this parlay. Although I'm pretty confident that I am going to end up including one for the next fight, which is Alexander Volkov and Tai Tuivasa. So there's a lot of optimism around Tuivasa, and it sucks that I've, for all the insisting on this card I've done about, you got to factor the crowd in their favor because, if it goes to decision. But you can't feel good about any heavyweight fight going to decision. So even though the crowd is going to be enthusiastic for Tuivasa, I don't know if it's going to factor in as much as it does for these other fights. And you look at the numbers here, and I really didn't expect the striking discrepancy numbers that came out when I put together this comparison. It's baffling to me that Volkov has the edge everywhere, that he eats almost a whole strike and a half less than Tuivasa does. That their ratio in terms of strikes that they absorb versus land, Volkov lands nearly 2 more So nearly lands 5 for every 3 that he takes, compared to Tuivasa eating almost half a strike more for every 1 that he lands. So it was baffling for me to see that. Tuivasa does have the edge, I think, in terms of just raw power and finishing ability. And he's also slightly got the edge in terms of attrition by numbers. But when you look at it further, Volkov's only been knocked out twice in his entire career, and Tuivasa has been knocked out twice in his last 2 fights. The attrition discrepancy is enormous here, and we know Tuivasa doesn't supply a submission threat, which is the majority of where Volkov has been finished in his MMA career. Volkov's got considerably more experience going the distance than Tuivasa does, if it does come to that, and he also has more final round experience. He's going to have a nearly 6-inch reach advantage, and he is already going to be nearly 6 inches taller than him. Outside of stance and finishing ability at the UFC level and attrition ever so slightly, not even based on chin alone, Tuivasa doesn't have really any edges here by numbers. And he's on more ring rust, and Volkov's got better momentum. And I just see this going very similarly to how when Volkov fought Rosenstrike. Like, you go back and watch that fight, and Volkov was able, he did a good job mixing up his approach in terms of targeting the body, not just with front kicks, but also with straight punches. And he was just very, very composed. And he even took a pretty solid, I think it was a right hook from Rosenstrike while he was almost standing straight up. And he didn't get fazed by it at all. In fact, he kind of used the exchange to correct his position and force Rosenstrike back against the fence. And then that was when he started to tee off on him, sent his mouthpiece flying, landed the finishing combo that forced Herb Dean to stop the fight. I think Tuivasa's probably going to show a little bit more resistance and swing back than what Rosenstrike did, but I would be interested to even see a fight between those two, just because they have such similar skill sets, and you know they're going to stand and bang. And I just see it kind of going similarly. And I think Rosenstrike also offered a bit more of an athleticism edge than what Tuivasa has here. I just wonder if this fight is kind of a story that we've seen before. And spiritually, it sucks to bet against Tai, but it's just, you look at his recent momentum relative to Volkov's, and you look at the kind of fighter that Volkov recently defeated during that stretch in Rosenstrike, and the similarities in how that matchup is presumed to play out relative to this one. I don't know how you can feel good about Tai here other than calling him a YOLO hometown underdog. I hope it goes to decision. For Tai's sake, I don't think it's going to. I'm going to say Volkov wins by second round knockout. But that they have but Volkov is able to keep Tai measured in the first round. Tai crashes the range in an exciting way a few times, but Volkov is ultimately able to stay out of danger and keep landing strikes that do compounding damage, and that carries over into the second round. Tuivasa starts to get more tired, and Volkov, when Tuivasa has to go for broke at some point, Volkov is able to find the winning combination that gets him the finish. So I would have Volkov graded as like a 300 favorite if this fight weren't happening in Australia. one of the other heavyweight sharps that I trust that does a big public show, Dan Best Fight Picks, Dan Levy, I believe. He's also on Volkov this week, even though he's not laying money on him. But that's one of the heavyweight sharps I trust. And he did a show with a UFC guy that's an Australian UFC vet this week. And the veteran picked Tuivasa and kind of did it on the basis that he thought it was going to be like a Vincente Luque, Randy Brown situation in terms of deploying the leg kicks. Rosenstrike was a kickboxer and tried to deploy leg kicks against Volkov, and it didn't really find any success. I don't necessarily think Tuivasa is going to have more success in that department than Rosenstrike did. It's gonna be unfortunate that I think I do have to put together 4-leg parlays this week. But in the event that I do, my third leg, I think Volkov kind of has to be the lock between the assortment of Jung and Mullarkey and Jenkins. I would say Volkov is certainly the most confident of those four, even in terms of who I'd be considering. So I'm looking at a Jenkins, not Jenkins. I'm looking at an Ulberg, Tafa -1.5, Volkov 3-leg parlay, and then potentially adding on one of Jenkins, Mullarkey. I think that's going to be my 4-leg parlay hedge this week. So we'll see how that goes. And now we've come to the main event, which is Israel, the last style bender, Adesanya, and Sean Strickland. This is such a funny main event for me personally. If you listen to the UFC Vegas 76 show, which I hope you did because that was my first show coming off of a clean sweep, then you listen to the story that I told about Sean Strickland and my betting career going back to when he fought Uriah Hall. And so you understand how glorious, how retribution obtaining for me it was to see Strickland keep my perfect streak going and take down a Boost Magomedov at UFC Vegas 76. Seeing him now get paired up after that against the guy that I moved into my apartment here in Miami, and it was like the day before I moved in the day before UFC 287. So I had my ticket. I moved in, and then I literally just walked out of the street, and I went and sat like 50 to 75 yards away. I don't think it was even 75. I think it was closer to 50 yards away from a certain United States president that everybody thought was supposed to be in jail that night. But not only that, I saw Izzy shoot the arrows that far away into Pereira. It was amazing. And for me, in terms of all the work that I put into getting to that seat, like the knowledge and the research and the financial success and accounting and just building a brand, I don't even think at that point that I had 500 followers. And just seeing how much growth has happened since that moment back in April is kind of amazing to see. It wasn't a winning that night because of Raul Rosas Jr., more because of a hedge on a weight cut that bit me in the ass, but it was still such a soul vindicating experience for me personally, being able to see that triumph that Izzy had. And when MMA Rax finally goes live as the content platform that I envision for it one day, one of the first things I am going to write about is, my own personal success that I had in getting to that moment relative to the speech that Izzy gave about fortifying your mind and, going for risk and the things that you want in life, that he talked about after he overcame his nemesis finally in Pereira. The poeticism of that moment is really, it's difficult to encompass without exploring it in written down word at length. Not just for myself, but what a moment like that can mean for so many people. And I look forward to doing that on this platform one day. So I just frame it like that because I'm going to be thinking about all of these things while I'm watching this fight between Adesanya and Strickland. Because these are two characters that in this, I mean, I'm coming up on 600 fighters that I've looked at in total, going back to last February. And I can tell you that these are two of the most fascinating characters across those 600 individuals that I've looked at quite easily. Even disregarding the personal betting experience I've alluded to that I had with each of them. So it's going to be an interesting main event for me to watch. I do. So listen, I'm also one of the people that, our favorite Nubian bookstore owner reached out to this week and was asking, what is what with the price being so outrageous on Strickland, what's the lowest range you'd have to consider betting on him? And I was just like, man, I wouldn't even do it. I don't see any avenues to victory. And I really don't for Strickland. The thing that I'm going to be more concerned about going into this is, does his chin hold up? I do think that Strickland is being heavily disrespected on the value, but I also can understand it because you just don't see, in theory, any paths to victory for him beyond wrestling, which no one's been successfully able to implement over Adesanya in a way that they've been able to get a decision on him at middleweight. So maybe he's looking heavily at the film from the Jan fight and thinking he can do that, but in theory he was supposed to do that against Pereira, and then he opted to stand and bang, and we saw what happened there. And I, as I alluded to in my story that I told for Vegas 76, I lost so much potential units that night on a 7-leg parlay that went belly up, that I also had Barberena on. And it's just so crazy how it can just, I just can't believe in hindsight that I picked Strickland to beat Pereira, and I should have hedged on the under. But I would have been tempted to hedge on the over in that case just because of the history of Strickland. Devastating. Anyway, I look at this and I just think about how these guys in 5-round fights have consistently tried to stretch things out. And I think this fight is really just going to come down to, does Izzy want to play with his food or not, I think. If Izzy is aggressive, I don't think that he's going to take any shots in a way that would compromise him immediately as he had the danger of in the Pereira fight. I think where this gets dangerous is when Strickland is able to turn it up in rounds 3, 4, and 5. So it's possible that Izzy recognizes that and tries to put him away early, but it's also possible that Izzy is supremely confident in his ability to control range and exploit Strickland's kind of unorthodox fundamentals, unorthodox at best. Really, we've seen, sharpshooters like Pereira be able to exploit them. And I don't know if you've seen the video of, I believe, it's Dan Hardy reacting to Strickland's kick defense against Magomedov, but it's not always aesthetically the most pleasing style, but it's awkwardly effective. It's one of the things that makes Strickland so good. So I think that he's going to make this more of a fight than people, or at least the betting odds would imply. But Izzy's got the better camp. He's got the better tolerance to damage. He's got the better threat of power. I think he's going to be able to move around the cage better. He's just got sharper fundamentals. If Strickland's able to make this like a complete MMA fight, it gets interesting. But if you're going to invite those possibilities with if Strickland can do this or that, and I do, then I think that this becomes a more competitive fight than people are anticipating. And the longer that competition stretches out, the less likely a finish becomes. Most of these finishes happen very early on in the fights, not necessarily later on. So if Izzy isn't able to put him out in the first 2 rounds, I'm going to feel very good about the 4.5, which is at pick'em odds right now, converting. And that's what I'm going to go with, because that's consistently been a winner for my history of betting on Strickland and Izzy is going with their overs. I know I took the under the first time that Adesanya fought Pereira, but I should have taken the over when he fought Cannonier, and that was a mistake. Now the over has actually fallen considerably to plus 115, so that's an outright underdog pick for me. So I am going to roll with that. History says these guys like going to the cards. And I think Adesanya will feel comfortable going to the cards if it comes to that. So I'm worried we're in for a bit of a Strickland snoozer. It'll be interesting to see what happens if he gets frustrated and he's not winning. And if Izzy's able to catch him. I'm going to feel kind of silly if I've done a sweep up to this point and then I lose out on like a big parlay because Strickland gets thwomped. But, if I've already lost out earlier in the night, it's not going to sting as much, even though it'll mean that I don't get 10 of 12 cards profitable. And I'm also going for 6 cards in a row of profitability, which would be a record. So we'll see if I can get it done. But I'm taking the over on 4.5. There's better value on it than when I called it earlier tonight. So go out and get it. Yeah. That's going to do it for UFC 293. Thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back next week for UFC Noche in... Oh, I thought it was in Mexico City, but I guess it's in Vegas. So I don't know why they're putting this Noche slant on it. No sé. Pero, it looks like they're trying to get Ponzinibbio on this card. I don't know if he had an opponent previously, but it looks like they pulled out. That stinks. I'm not necessarily excited for that Rosas fight. I don't know why Christos Yagos is on a main card for a UFC event again either. Although I guess they're trying to get Zaluber his win. Fernando Padilla, it'll be interesting to see him. I do hope that Kyle Nelson gets put out pretty bad. But, yeah, that Grasso-Chevy Chonks fight's going to be great. And Holland-Madalena, I am surprised that fight is lined as close as it is. So I'm looking forward to that one. I think there's some good spots next week. But until then, thank you very much for tuning into the MMA RAXPOD, and we'll be back next week. please hit like, share, and subscribe on Twitter and on YouTube. And we'll be back for more fight analysis next week. And for the week after that, before we finally get a nice break after, I believe, something like 3 straight months of UFC. So, looking forward to it. Thanks for tuning in, and good luck with your bets this week. Take care, folks.